In 1862, 143 unmarked graves were found under the floorboards of an abandoned church in the wild forests of upstate New York. Each skeleton displayed evidence of systematic torture, according to the local authorities, including bizarre patterns cut into their bones, damaged limbs that had healed before death, and traces of recurrent near drowning. Federal documents pertaining to the Church of the Pure Spirit were sealed for more than 160 years and were only available to individuals with certain authorization. I have access to previously undisclosed documents that describe how three brothers, Elder Ezra, Deacon Silas, and Prophet Caleb Ravencraft, convinced hundreds of loyal followers that the only way to salvation was through suffering, and how their sinister purification rites created what may be the most unsettling religious cult in American history. During the early 19th century, Ravenwood, a small upstate New York town, was largely nondescript. Situated about 40 miles north of Albany, surrounded by thick forests and undulating hills, it was home to about 300 people who lived off of farming, lumbering, and trading with nearby settlements. In search of new prospects and good land, people from the Hudson Valley moved north and created the town in 1803. Ravenwood was in the core of what historians would later refer to as the Second Great Awakening, a period of strong religious revival that swept over America in the early 1800s. Much like much of upstate New York during this time, the area was dubbed the Burned-Over District because of the zeal of religious groups that appeared to spark and spread throughout its towns like wildfire. It was a time when charismatic preachers could attract thousands of people to outdoor revival meetings, when new denominations were formed, and when traditional beliefs were questioned. In the summer of 1825, the Ravencraft brothers entered this spiritual upheaval. At 42, Elder Ezra was the oldest, and exuded the authoritative demeanor of a man used to being submissive. When he talked about holy topics, his deep-set eyes, which were almost black in some light, appeared to look right into one's soul. With wire-rimmed glasses and thin fingers that were always smeared with ink from his constant writing of theological books, Deacon Silas, 39, had a more scholarly appearance. At 35, Prophet Caleb was the youngest and had an eerie aura that many found both alluring and unnerving. His pale blue eyes would frequently roll back during what he said were visions from God, and he spoke in whispers that strangely reverberated across packed rooms. When the brothers arrived, they had a lot of money, so they bought a big piece of land on the outskirts of town and started building what they called the Church of the Pure Spirit. Their church was made of dark stone that was quarried from the nearby hills, in contrast to the plain white clapboard meeting houses that were typical in New England and New York. Its odd building included an octagonal sanctuary in the center, encircled by 8 smaller rooms, and a steeple that seemed out of proportion for such a remote place. The main sanctuary's lack of windows and reliance on strategically placed lanterns for illumination during services was the most notable feature. Elder Ezra declared, "We have been called by the Spirit to this place," at their first meeting, which, in spite of the locals' initial mistrust, had drawn a sizable crowd. In an age of false prophets and lukewarm faith, we bring the true message of purification through tribulation. The Spirit has revealed to us that this community shall be the cradle of a new understanding. The brothers had arrived at the ideal moment. America's religious scene in 1825 was unstable and shattered. More sentimental and expressive religions were gaining ground on traditional churches like the Presbyterians and Episcopalians. Through circuit riders who delivered ferocious sermons to the frontier, Methodists were attracting followers. With their focus on personal conversion experiences, Baptists were growing quickly, and new faiths that originated in America were starting to appear. When Joseph Smith released the Book of Mormon in 1830, the Mormons would set out fewer than 100 miles away, and a year later, the message of the Ravencraft found a receptive audience in this atmosphere of spiritual exploration. At first, their philosophy was surprisingly straightforward. Pain that burned away sin and impurity was the only way to truly be saved. Scripture verses concerning Christ's suffering on the cross and refinement by fire were cited. However, their literal interpretation that bodily pain was not merely symbolic, but really required for spiritual cleansing, set their doctrine apart. The flesh, is the vessel of sin, Deacon Silas would say, in his calm, controlled voice during early sermons. Therefore, the flesh must be tested, tried, and purified through tribulation. Only when the body has been broken can the spirit truly soar. During that first year, their congregation grew steadily. Those who were accepted were mostly from three groups: the extremely poor looking for a sense of belonging and purpose, the deeply troubled seeking atonement for past sins, and the wealthy seeking spiritual experiences beyond what traditional churches provided. The brothers were picky about who could join, requiring prospective members to go through a discernment interview with Prophet Caleb, who would decide if they were worthy vessels for purification. Margaret Wilkins, a widow who had lost her husband and 2 children to scarlet fever the winter before, was one of the earliest converts. When she met Elder Ezra in town, she had been thinking about taking her own life. She wrote, "He looked at me as though he could see my thoughts," in a journal that federal investigators later found. "He told me my suffering had meaning, that it was preparing me for a greater purpose. For the first time since burying my family, I felt something other than despair." The Church of the Pure Spirit had around 100 members by 1827. While some kept residences in Ravenwood but mostly stayed at the church property, others lived in modest bungalows built around the church. Because earthly attachments impede spiritual ascent, the Ravencrafts urged members to give their savings and possessions to the church. The most devout adherents were asked to become vessels of the Spirit, a unique position that necessitated more thorough purifying procedures. Few outsiders realized how deliberately the Ravencrafts were increasing the intensity of these practices, which were relatively mild in comparison to what would follow: nightly prayer vigils, prolonged fasting, and rituals involving ice-cold water that represented the drowning of the sinful self. Their followers were being conditioned to embrace ever more radical types of purification without realizing the perilous route they were taking, much like the frog in steadily boiling water. When work on a vast system of chambers beneath the church started in 1829, the Ravencrafts had total authority over the bodies, minds, and lives of their adherents. The Church of the Pure Spirit was prepared for darkness to fall. The people of Ravenwood would soon learn that the Ravencraft brothers' definition of shepherd had nothing to do with protection and everything to do with sacrifice. As Prophet Caleb supposedly stated to his brothers in a private meeting that was recorded years later, "The sheep have been gathered. Now begins the true work of the shepherd." One particular date, the 21st of December, 1829, the winter solstice, the longest night of the year, is responsible for the Church of the Pure Spirit's metamorphosis from an odd but ostensibly benign religious organization to something far more evil. The events of that night would subsequently be known as the First Ascension in confidential church records, and they would set the stage for the subsequent atrocities. Elder Ezra announced at the start of the day that Prophet Caleb had had a significant vision throughout the night. For what was characterized as a revelation of the next degree of cleansing, the entire congregation was called to the church. Nearly 150 devotees crowded the windowless sanctuary as night approached and the temperature plummeted below zero. The only light came from 12 big candles placed at the points of a massive pattern carved into the oak floor, a spiral that curved inward toward a central platform. A blacksmith named Thomas Hartford, who had joined the religion 6 months prior when his wife passed away, later escaped and testified about what transpired. Hartford said that Elder Ezra spoke to the assembly with a ferocity that was rare for him, raising his voice to a fever pitch as he explained that their prior purification practices had just served as a prelude to the actual cleansing. "Brothers and sisters," said Elder Ezra, "we have been patient shepherds, guiding you gently toward understanding, but the Spirit grows impatient with our progress. Tonight, Prophet Caleb has been shown the true path to salvation, and it requires greater courage than we have yet demanded." It was then that Prophet Caleb came out of one of the side rooms. According to witnesses, he looked changed, his skin unusually pale, and his motions jerky and clumsy. When he rolled his eyes back, only whites were visible. He started talking in what he described as the tongue of angels, a string of high-pitched cries and guttural noises that reverberated throughout the sanctuary. Prophet Caleb fell to the ground after witnessing this unsettling spectacle for a few minutes. He spoke in his usual voice when he stood up again, but many people found his power and cadence captivating. He declared that 3 congregation members, Sarah Pembroke, Michael Collins, and Rebecca Winters, had been chosen by the Spirit to receive the honor of first ascension. When he said, "The Spirit has found you worthy of elevation," Deacon Silas escorted the 3, who were all relatively new church members, to the main platform. Hartford characterized what transpired as a ceremony unlike anything I believed possible among civilized people. Despite the winter cold, all 3 were undressed down to their underpants. After that, they were secured to wooden frames that had been built to resemble upside-down crosses. The assembly was informed by Elder Ezra that the inversion of the sacred emblem signified the necessary reversal of fortune, not blasphemy, but rather the passage from pride to humility, from comfort to suffering, from life to death to rebirth. Over the course of the following few hours, the Ravencraft brothers tortured the 3 selected individuals in a series of procedures they dubbed the 7 trials of purification. The first was the trial of air, which involved covering their faces with damp cloths and gradually pouring water over them to make them feel as though they were drowning. Then came the trial of earth, in which they were essentially buried alive for brief periods of time by having soil from the church grounds heaped around their bodies up to their necks. The trial of fire entailed applying hot metal tools to their skin for a brief period of time, leaving distinct patterns of burn marks. They were repeatedly immersed in freezing water during the trial of water until they passed out and were subsequently resuscitated. When discussing the last 3 trials, Hartford's evidence becomes disjointed because he acknowledged that he had puked and almost passed out throughout the hearings. Multiple versions make it abundantly evident that the 3 victims were urged to accept their agony as a gift from God during these tortures. When they shouted in agony, the crowd was told to chant, "Through suffering comes purity, through purity comes elevation." The congregation's reaction was the most unsettling. According to Hartford, several members seemed enthralled, watching with displays of joy or awe, while others sobbed quietly or turned their heads away. The tragic results of the Ravencrafts' years-long training of their adherents to link suffering with spiritual growth were now evident. The 3 victims hung limp on their frames, scarcely conscious but still alive, near daybreak when the 7 trials were over. The events that followed would haunt those who watched it for the rest of their lives. Elder Ezra declared that they had been emptied of sin and were now prepared to be filled with the pure Spirit. Each victim was approached by Prophet Caleb, who whispered into their ears while placing his hands on their heads. Hartford and another witness, who later testified before authorities, claimed that the 3 victims experienced a rapid, severe convulsion in which their bodies arching against their bonds with such force that they could hear bones cracking. Their eyes sprung wide, bloodshot and bulging, and they started talking in the same weird language that Prophet Caleb had shown them before. All 3 were dead by dawn. They had successfully ascended, according to Elder Ezra, who also said that their spirits had been so perfectly cleansed that they had been admitted straight into heaven, avoiding judgment. He clarified that their bodies were now only empty containers that were to be treasured as sacred artifacts. The 3 bodies were not interred right away. Rather, they were positioned on stone slabs in one of the recently built rooms underneath the church, where members of the congregation could see them and offer prayers for a comparable elevation. These were the first of hundreds of bodies that would eventually be kept in the catacombs beneath the Church of the Pure Spirit, according to church documents that were later confiscated by authorities. Several members of the church discreetly packed their things and left Ravenwood the morning following the first ascension. Among them was Thomas Hartford, who for long years refused to talk about what he had seen because he thought no one would accept that such atrocities could exist in Christian America. Those who stayed were even more committed to the perverse theology of the Ravencrafts. After crossing the line into murder under the pretext of a religious ceremony, the brothers discovered that their authority over their followers had increased rather than decreased. Death was now considered a sacrament in the Church of the Pure Spirit. According to a conversation later related by a church elder who later turned state's evidence, Prophet Caleb informed his brothers after the ceremony, "Now we have shown them the true face of God. And they did not turn away. There is nothing they will not accept from us now. He was correct. The crimes at the Church of the Pure Spirit did not end with the first ascension. 3 decades of increasing tragedy would ensue, concealed behind the honorable guise of religious devotion. The Church of the Pure Spirit saw a metamorphosis in the years after the first ascension, which the outside world mostly ignored. The Ravencraft brothers developed their theological defenses and practical tactics for what they called elevations, but which were actually ritualized assassinations. Between 1830 and 1845. During this time, they also increased their power and improved their methods. The brothers took pains to keep up a facade of respectability. Their church's public persona placed a strong emphasis on spiritual regeneration, community, and charity themes that were in line with the burned-over district's current religious renaissance. On the outside, they took part in the larger religious society by donating to organizations like temperance societies and orphanages, and occasionally sponsoring events when other preachers were invited to speak. But beneath this front, their actual methods of functioning became more intricate and unsettling. Originally built as straightforward cellars, the underground chambers were later enlarged into a complex system of passageways and rooms that went well beyond the boundaries of the cathedral. Devoted church members who could be trusted with secrets eventually took the place of local laborers engaged for the original construction, and eventually only vessels of the Spirit followers who had demonstrated their unwavering loyalty performed the excavation. By 1835, there were dozens of smaller alcoves and at least 7 enormous chambers in what the inner circle started to refer to as the catacombs. The chamber of preparation, where candidates for elevation were sequestered for days prior to their ordeal. The chamber of trials, where the 7 purification tortures were administered. The chamber of ascension, where the final fatal rituals were performed. And, most unsettling of all, the chamber of saints, where the bodies of the ascended were preserved. Each had a distinct purpose in the twisted theology of the Ravencraft. One of the main components of the cult's activities became the preservation of corpses. The Ravencrafts preserved their victims' bodies in different states of preservation, in contrast to most religious communities that bury their deceased with reverence. Using methods Deacon Silas supposedly learned from medical texts, several were partially mummified. Others, using techniques that investigators would later find difficult to reconstruct, were reduced to neat skeletons. These remains, which were occasionally articulated with wire to maintain their posture, were placed in prayerful or ecstatic poses in ornate tableaux scattered throughout the saint's chamber. Some of the most thorough descriptions of these rooms were given by Elizabeth Carver, who became a member of the church in 1832 and eventually fled in 1844. When she told federal investigators, "The smell was the first thing that struck you. Not the stench of decay as one might expect, but the overwhelming odor of chemicals, turpentine, alcohol, and something sweeter I couldn't identify." The brothers claimed it was the perfume of sanctity, but I later learned it was substances used in embalming. Carver explained how new members were progressively made aware of the chamber's existence, first hearing about them as symbolic places, then being given restricted access to the less unsettling sections, and finally, for the most devoted, being given the opportunity to observe or even take part in the rituals performed there. It was a careful seduction, she clarified. By the time you saw the Chamber of Saints with its dozens of corpses arranged like some grotesque congregation, you had been so thoroughly indoctrinated that it seemed beautiful rather than horrifying. I remember weeping with what I thought was religious ecstasy the first time I was permitted entry. Now those tears shame me beyond words. Over time, the frequency of elevations grew steadily. There were only 2 such rituals in 1830, which led to 5 fatalities, according to church documents that were later taken as evidence. By 1840, monthly elevations had become the norm, with exceptional ceremonies on solstices and equinoxes frequently taking larger numbers of victims. By 1835, the number had increased to quarterly events, each of which claimed 2 to 4 lives. When selecting people for promotion, the Ravencrafts started to be picky. Their first preference was for individuals who had no direct familial ties, widows, orphans, and vagrants who would not be missed. They later started choosing from loyal families in the church as their confidence increased, portraying selection as the greatest honor a family could obtain. To give a child to the Spirit was considered the ultimate expression of faith. Carver said, "Parents would compete for this blessing, offering their sons and daughters with a fervor that seems unimaginable to me now." The brothers' private dynamic changed throughout time, even though they continued to play different roles. Prophet Caleb as the mystical conduit to the divine, Deacon Silas as the intellectual theologian, and Elder Ezra as the authoritative voice. As his insights guided more and more facets of church life, Caleb's influence increased, according to testimonies from former Inner Circle members. By 1840, Caleb was in charge of choosing every applicant for promotion and figuring out the particular rites that would be applied in each situation. During this time, his mental health seems to have declined considerably. He is credited with writing progressively illogical journal entries that were found in a secret room in his private quarters and mixed with intricate anatomical illustrations. A post dated 1842 states, "The Spirit has revealed that souls reside not merely in the heart or mind as commonly thought, but are distributed throughout the body in specific nodes. Each elevation allows me to map these sacred points more precisely. Soon, I shall have the complete divine anatomy." The Ravencrafts had to deal with the practical problem of getting rid of evidence from their growing number of elevations, as the church's membership reached around 300 by 1845. One of their most gruesome inventions resulted from this: the sale of human remains to medical colleges. Medical schools had trouble obtaining cadavers for anatomical research in the middle of the 19th century. There were not enough legal sources available for educational purposes because they were mostly restricted to executed offenders. As a result, there was a black market for bodies, with resurrection men unlawfully collecting unclaimed bodies from poorhouses or exhuming newly buried people. Deacon Silas, who had ties in academic circles due to his intellectual endeavors, developed relationships with agents who provided medical schools in Albany, New York City, and even Philadelphia. At least 67 vessels were donated to the advancement of medical science between 1840 and 1845, according to church documents. This is a euphemism for the sale of murder victims' bodies. For the Ravencrafts, this commercial element had several functions. It disposed of evidence, brought in a substantial sum of money for the church, and gave Deacon Silas access to medical information that he integrated into the cult's rituals. He gained knowledge from these exchanges that would make the church's subsequent crimes even more sophisticated, including better preservation practices and more effective ways to inflict pain without leaving visible scars. From a niche religious organization, the Church of the Pure Spirit had transformed into something unparalleled by 1845. A self-sustaining system of ritual murder, indoctrination, and profit masquerading as spiritual growth. Under the guise of religious freedom, the brothers had built what one FBI investigator would later refer to as a perfect machine for evil, functioning covertly. However, rumors started to circulate in spite of their meticulous control over looks. Questions were raised by the overwhelming number of persons who had joined the church but then vanished from public life. Although ex-members who had escaped never talked candidly about their experiences out of fear of incredulity or reprisal, their eerie looks and hesitation to talk about their time with the Ravencrafts stoked suspicions in the community. These escalating rumors, along with a surprising finding by a postal inspector looking into financial irregularities, were what would ultimately bring the silent horror at Ravenwood to the attention of the authorities. However, such reckoning was still years away. For the time being, the Church of the Pure Spirit persisted in its sinister activities, its actual character concealed beneath the religious respectability and ardent devotion of adherents who had been instructed to view murder as the pinnacle of worship. If you're enjoying this gloomy account of religious tragedy in America's past, please subscribe to our channel and let us know which state or city you're from before we move on to the Church of the Pure Spirit story. With your help, we can uncover more of these long-forgotten historical horrors. Let's go back to the Ravencraft brothers' perverse universe now. The late 1842 saw the height of the Church of the Pure Spirit's public image. Riding the crest of the Second Great Awakening, the Ravencraft brothers seemed to the outer world to be prosperous religious leaders. In addition to the main church building and underground chambers, their property had grown to include modest dwellings for families, dormitories for single members, workshops for making church items, and even a tiny school for followers' children. The affluence and orderliness of the religious community were frequently praised by visitors to Ravenwood. The Ravencrafts were extremely selective about who they let on their property, usually allowing only carefully screened converts or well-respected local leaders they wanted to win over. Outsiders witnessed a hard-working religious community whose members collaborated, worshipped, and helped one another during their authorized visits. What was not visible was the network of psychological manipulation, the nightly ceremonies in the subterranean rooms, and the steadily rising number of elevations. The Ravencraft brothers' increasing wealth, which was obtained through donations from followers, the sale of human remains to medical schools, and other enterprises run under church ecclesiastical aegis, but largely for the brothers' benefit, was also concealed. In 1847, James Thornhill, a postal inspector looking into financial irregularities in a number of upstate New York communities, noticed odd patterns in banking transactions related to the Church of the Pure Spirit. Large sums deposited at irregular intervals, always in cash. This was the first major thread that would eventually tear apart their meticulously crafted facade. Amounts consistent with institutional deposits rather than individual banking transfers to medical colleges in Albany, Philadelphia, and Baltimore, with vague notations regarding research donations, Thornhill wrote in his official report. Had Thornhill not come across Martha Simmons, a former churchgoer who had left the area after seeing her sister's elevation in 1846, his research could have stayed narrowly focused on possible financial irregularities. Though initially hesitant to discuss her experiences, Simmons ultimately gave Thornhill the first formal testimony regarding the actual nature of the Ravencrafts' operations. She described torture rites, bodies stored in subterranean rooms, and youngsters chosen for special blessings who were never seen again. Thornhill stated, "Claims so outlandish that I would have dismissed them as the ravings of a disturbed mind, had they not aligned so perfectly with the financial irregularities I'd already documented." When Thornhill voiced his concerns to his superiors, they gave him a mediocre answer at best. There were strict protections for religious freedom, and it took extraordinary proof to accuse a church. Without authorization to conduct a formal inquiry, Thornhill persisted in his clandestine information gathering, establishing a network of contacts in the Ravenwood area who might provide updates on the church's operations. Dr. William Garrett, a doctor in Albany who had been concerned about the state of cadavers he inspected that purportedly originated from the Church of the Pure Spirit, was one such encounter. Standard practice was to receive bodies of the deceased who had donated their remains to medical science, Garrett said in court. But these specimens showed signs of systematic anti-mortem trauma, injuries sustained before death that had partially healed, and the manner of death itself was consistent across multiple bodies. Evidence of asphyxiation combined with extreme physical stress. In 1850, Garrett covertly contacted Thornhill and sent him thorough medical reports on 7 of the victims he had studied. The first scientific proof that a nefarious event was taking place in the Church of the Pure Spirit came from these publications. Nevertheless, in the absence of unquestionable evidence of criminal behavior, authorities were still hesitant to take action against a religious group. Unexpectedly, the breakthrough was made. After years of decline, Prophet Caleb Ravencraft's mental health reached a breaking point in the spring of 1851. He started having violent episodes, raving about ghosts coming out of the walls and the divine anatomy appearing in the air, according to churchgoers who later testified. Even his most devout followers found his prophetic statements to be more and more strange and terrifying during church services. In an effort to control the issue, Elder Ezra and Deacon Silas limited Prophet Caleb's public appearances and justified his absences by claiming that they were times of deep spiritual communion. But in secret, they locked him in a specially built room in the deepest part of the subterranean rooms, where his cries would be inaudible from above. If Prophet Caleb hadn't escaped during a brief oversight, this confinement might have solved the immediate issue. Somehow, on the evening of the 17th of June, 1851, he managed to escape his bonds and navigate the catacombs until emerging in the woods outside the chapel. The Albany Evening Journal called what transpired a scene of public madness unprecedented in the region's history. Prophet Caleb showed up in Ravenwood's town square during a community gathering commemorating the Kadring summer planting, naked and covered in wounds he had inflicted on himself. He declared himself the living vessel of the pure spirit in front of a horde of appalled spectators, and started outlining in great detail the rites performed beneath the cathedral. "The blood of the purified strengthens our connection to the divine," he allegedly exclaimed. 217 vessels have been emptied, and the Spirit has filled me with their essence. The chambers beneath hold the sacred remains of the elevated, and soon all of you shall join them in glorious suffering. Prophet Caleb was arrested by the local authorities, who at first thought he was just a dangerous madman, but his rants gained new meaning when he revealed that he was one of the Ravencraft brothers. Thornhill, who had developed connections with a number of local authorities, was informed right away. The next day he came to Ravenwood to speak with Prophet Caleb. What he discovered was a man nearing the end of his mental breakdown. Prophet Caleb alternated between bouts of frantic confession and catatonic quiet, during which he revealed information about the church's operations that supported previous accounts from members who had fled. Most notably, he created thorough drawings of the subterranean rooms, showing the locations of secret doors and the Chamber of Saints, which housed the remains of the victims. Equipped with this fresh information and the first-hand account of Prophet Caleb, Thornhill was able to obtain approval for an official investigation. However, before police could arrange a proper search of the church premises, Elder Ezra and Deacon Silas learned of Prophet Caleb's arrest and subsequent interrogation. The brothers' brutal crisis management skills were evident in what transpired next. As soon as they learned of Prophet Caleb's arrest, they began what church records later disclosed was a backup plan known as the Cleansing Flame. Members of the inner circle were sent to clear the underground chambers of the most damning evidence, especially financial documents and the most recent corpses. Then, in a desperate and strategically shrewd move, they set up a controlled fire in the main church building. In order to give the impression of a sad accident rather than the intentional elimination of evidence, the fire was meticulously lit to destroy some areas while leaving others untouched. On June 19, 1851, when officials arrived with a search warrant, they discovered that the church building had half burned and that the congregation was working to recover. Elder Ezra offered complete access to the premises and expressed dismay at his brother's mental breakdown as he greeted officials with seeming cooperation. "It seems God has tested us doubly, according to reports, first with the affliction of my beloved brother's mind, and now with this terrible fire. But we shall rebuild, as faith must always rise from ashes." The brothers' careful planning, in addition to the fire damage, complicated the subsequent investigation. Access was challenging because the main tunnel system's entrance had collapsed during the fire. When the underground chambers were eventually discovered during excavation, researchers discovered that they were partially flooded due to water that had been purposefully diverted from a nearby stream. There was evidence of hurried removal, as many rooms had been cleared of their furnishings. However, there was still sufficient evidence to support the most unsettling parts of Prophet Caleb's admission. Investigators found customized restraints, torture-modified instruments, and embalming chemical compounds in rooms that had escaped both fire and floods. The most incriminating was the Chamber of Saints, where hundreds of preserved human remains were discovered in spite of efforts to destroy evidence. "The scene defies adequate description," Daniel Blackwood, a federal investigator, stated in his formal filing. "Skeletal remains arranged in poses of supplication, partially preserved corpses seated as though participating in some macabre congregation, and most disturbing, small chambers containing the remains of children, positioned as though at play, but bearing clear evidence of violent deaths." Even seasoned investigators were taken aback by the discovery. Despite being severely edited for Victorian sensibilities, newspaper articles contained enough information to evoke universal dread. On the 25th of June, 1851, the headline of the Albany Evening Journal said, quite simply, "House of Worship Revealed as Charnel House, Brothers Accused of Unspeakable Acts in the Name of Religion." Elder Ezra and Deacon Silas insisted on their innocence, while investigators attempted to identify the dead and ascertain the complete scope of the Ravencrafts' misdeeds. They were shocked and appalled by the findings and asserted that Prophet Caleb had carried out his operations covertly, without their knowledge or consent. If it weren't for one last damning piece of evidence, their defense would have had some merit given their meticulous compartmentalization of church activities. A leather-bound ledger recording each elevation from 1829 to 1851 was found by investigators in a secret room under Deacon Silas's personal quarters. Names, dates, descriptions of techniques, and notations about the disposition of remains, including those sold to medical institutes, were all included in the book, which was written in Deacon Silas's characteristic handwriting. Entries that explicitly attributed guidance and involvement to all three brothers were the most damning, with particular reference to Elder Ezra's function in choosing candidates for promotion. The brothers' guilt was amply demonstrated by this ledger, former members' testimonies, and Prophet Caleb's confession. Elder Ezra and Deacon Silas Ravencraft were taken into custody on the 3rd of July, 1851, on several counts of murder, fraud, and desecration of human remains. One of the most dramatic cases of the mid-19th century would be the case against the Ravencraft brothers. The investigation continued to unearth new horrors, going far beyond the events at the church itself to include the brothers' earlier activities and the entire network of their operations. Even though authorities were worried about the potential impact on public morality and religious sensibilities, and kept much of the most disturbing evidence hidden from the public, the worst secrets of the Church of the Pure Spirit, however, remained buried as the judicial proceedings progressed, waiting to be unearthed by individuals who would carry out further research long after the Ravencrafts had been brought to justice. As the Church of the Pure Spirit inquiry progressed over the summer of 1851, officials discovered a criminal business that was much larger than they had first thought. The Ravencraft brothers had established not only a cult with abnormal behaviors, but a complex structure with ramifications in the fields of medicine, finance, and religion in America. Prophet Caleb had been confined to the state lunatic asylum at Utica because he was judged too mentally ill to stand trial, while Elder Ezra and Deacon Silas were still being held pending trial. Meanwhile, their followers had dispersed, with some escaping to avoid being prosecuted and others staying in Ravenwood in shock and amazement as the disclosures completely upended their worldview. The case's senior federal investigator, Daniel Blackwood, set up a makeshift office at Ravenwood to oversee the extensive inquiry. A troubling timetable that before the brothers' arrival in upstate New York even surfaced as he pieced together information from forensic analyses, witness statements, and church records. The Ravencrafts did not begin their crimes in Ravenwood. Blackwood instructed his superiors in Washington in a classified report. Evidence suggests similar activities in at least 3 previous locations dating back to 1817. In each case, they established a religious community, gathered vulnerable followers, and departed before authorities became suspicious. What distinguishes Ravenwood is not the nature of their activities, but their duration and scale. Before relocating to New York, the brothers had operated under several names in Connecticut, Pennsylvania, and Ohio, according to documents found in a secret vault beneath Deacon Silas's quarters. They had honed their techniques in each place, growing from their errors and creating the theological foundation that would eventually be the Church of the Pure Spirit's teaching. The proof that the brothers had not acted alone was the most unsettling. Deacon Silas's correspondence with people at various medical colleges revealed that he was aware, if not overtly so, of the illegal source of the specimens being supplied. Regarding the exceptional quality and unique preparation of bodies received from the church, a well-known Philadelphia anatomist wrote in a letter dated 1844 that the subjects show evidence of systematic anatomical study prior to death, as though the bodies were prepared for our work while still living. This discovery gave the case a new and terrifying dimension. The Ravencrafts had been doing systematic experiments on living people, recording their results, and selling the bodies and their research to medical organizations. They had not just been murdering their followers in the name of religious purification. In his expert evidence to investigators, Dr. Samuel Prescott of the Albany Medical College said, "The brothers appear to have been conducting a form of primitive physiological research. The patterns of injury, the methods of preserving tissue, and the detailed anatomical notes suggest an attempt to study human responses to various stimuli, particularly pain and its effects on the body systems." The investigation took a surprising turn in August 1851 when a reputable Boston physician came forward with facts that revolutionized our knowledge of the case. While attending Harvard Medical School in the 1820 seconds, Dr. Jonathan Crane had briefly met Simon Ravenwood, a visiting lecturer who offered contentious notions regarding religious ecstasy and pain reactions. "I remember being disturbed by his methods and conclusions," Dr. Crane said in his testimony. He described experiments that seemed unethical even by the standards of that time and spoke of pain as a gateway to transcendent experience. "I had dismissed him as a medical eccentric, but seeing the newspaper accounts of the Ravencraft case, I recognized not only the theories but the man himself from the published sketches." Simon Ravenwood and Silas Ravencraft are undoubtedly the same person. This relationship implied that the Church of the Pure Spirit's religious doctrine had been developed especially to support methodical human research, rather than serve as a tool for manipulating members or defending murder. The very behaviors that aided their research were not only accepted, but were sanctified by the belief system the brothers had established. Following this new line of investigation, detectives found hundreds of notebooks containing meticulous anatomical drawings, experimental procedures, and observations in a secret room beneath Deacon Silas's quarters. As time went on, the journal's wording became less religious and more scientific, documenting a hideous study program that lasted for decades. Subject 157 maintained consciousness for 47 minutes after removal of redacted. One especially unsettling 1,848 notes stated. Heart continued functioning for 12 minutes beyond loss of consciousness. Vocalization patterns consistent with previous trials. Blood loss measured at approximately 1.7 liters. Results support hypotheses regarding sustainability of vital functions under extreme conditions. Elder Ezra's pretense of religious commitment ultimately broke when this proof was shown to him during questioning. Before he spoke, he laughed for about a minute, according to interview transcripts. He allegedly said, "You understand nothing," to Blackwood. "The Spirit has many names. Some call it God, others science. We merely sought knowledge that others were too weak to pursue." The elevation of our followers was genuine. They contributed to understanding that will benefit mankind for generations. Their suffering had purpose. Their deaths had meaning. The medical establishment was rocked by the revelation of the brothers' genuine intentions. A wider discussion about ethical norms in medical research and education was compelled by the scrutiny surrounding a number of well-known doctors and medical schools that had obtained samples or studies from the Ravencrafts. In the meantime, investigators carried on with the grueling task of digging the church grounds as fall drew near. Prophet Caleb had claimed 217 vessels, which served as the basis for early estimates of the number of victims. However, as the excavation went on, it became evident that the true number was much greater. "We have identified remains of at least 276 individuals thus far," Blackwood stated in September. "Based on soil analysis and structural expansion of the underground chambers, we believe additional remains may be found beneath the adjacent property." The brothers appear to have been tunneling outward as their operation expanded. The finding of letters indicating that not all of the victims had been willing churchgoers further complicated the investigation. Letters exchanged between Elder Ezra and other friends in neighboring cities suggested a method for finding and obtaining suitable subjects, primarily newcomers, travelers, and others who would not be overlooked right away. "The red-haired Irishman who passed through last Thursday would make an excellent vessel," one such letter from a neighboring community's church member stated. This evidence changed our understanding of the case from one of religious extremism preying on willing followers to one that was more akin to organized kidnapping and murder for financial gain and pseudo-scientific research. No family, seeking work, strong constitution. I have directed him to Ravenwood with promise of employment at the mill. Expect his arrival by Saturday next. In addition to the magnitude of the brothers' crimes, the implications raise concerns about the possibility of a larger network of complicity. The terror in Ravenwood gets worse, just when we think we've seen it all. Please use the like button to support our content. Share this video with a friend who enjoys dark mysteries, and subscribe to ensure you never miss another story like this one. Together, let's find out what occurs next. Investigators' discovery of Samuel Parsons, who had been the church's accountant from 1835 to 1849 before being replaced by a more recent member, in October 1851 marked the turning point that would eventually expose the full scope of the Ravencrafts' business. Parsons had left the religion after learning the real reason for several financial transactions and was now living in western Massachusetts under a false identity. After being given immunity, Parsons stated, "I thought I was managing donations and legitimate business interests when I discovered entries for specimen preparation and research grants that corresponded with disappearances among the Pressum congregation. I began keeping private records. When Elder Ezra discovered my separate ledger, I was scheduled for special prayer counseling, a term I had learned meant selection for elevation. I fled that night with only the clothes on my back." From memory, Parsons gave investigators comprehensive financial details, including the names of medical organizations that had covered the cost of the bodies and the research, affluent donors who had supported the brothers' work because they thought it was valid scientific research, and churchgoers who had helped with different parts of the operation. Most importantly, he disclosed the whereabouts of a second site, almost 40 miles from Ravenwood, a secluded farmhouse that the brothers had acquired in 1840 through a middleman. Parsons claims that even the inner circle of the church was kept apart from the special research conducted here. Elder Ezra called it the garden, mentioned Parsons. Only he, Deacon Silas, and 2 trusted assistants ever went there. Supplies were delivered monthly. Medical equipment, chemicals, specialized restraints, and occasionally selected subjects would be transported there, always at night. None ever returned. Even the atrocities unearthed beneath the church paled in comparison to what officials found when they located and investigated the farmhouse. The structure had been transformed into an advanced research center, with rooms set up for various kinds of studies. According to thorough documents, this site had mostly been utilized for long-term research, with patients being kept alive for weeks or months while different treatments were carried out and recorded. The evidence that the brothers had been especially concerned in how their purification methods affected youngsters was the most unsettling. Small cells and equipment sized for young subjects were housed in a separate building on the grounds. The facility housed at least 37 children between the ages of 4 and 16, according to records, between 1,840 and 1,851. More public outcry was sparked by this discovery than ever before. The New York Tribune ran the headline, "Monsters in Human Form. Ravencraft Brothers, Crimes Against Innocents Revealed." Public protests called for immediate justice, and political pressure grew for a model prosecution. Newspapers that had previously covered the case with relative restraint now published graphic details. According to reports, Elder Ezra and Deacon Silas, who had remained composed during previous stages of the investigation, began to falter under the weight of the evidence that had accumulated. Elder Ezra had started communicating with unseen entities in his cell, according to prison guards, while Deacon Silas had tried suicide after being presented with proof from the garden. The lawsuit against the Ravencraft brothers had become a national phenomenon by the end of 1851, having begun as a local nightmare. With ramifications for the defendants as well as for medical ethics, religious freedom, and the sinister potential that can lurk behind honorable facades, the trial was set to be one of the most important criminal procedures in American history. But as the trial got closer, investigator Blackwood continued to be concerned about unanswered questions. Too many years and places passed for the brothers' deeds to have gone entirely unnoticed. The sophistication of their operation showed resources beyond what church donations alone could supply, and their ties to medical institutes and rich donors suggested a level of security that was impossible without some kind of state cooperation. In December 1851, Blackwood wrote in his private notebook, "I am becoming more and more convinced that we have discovered only the visible part of something far more extensive. The Ravencrafts are undoubtedly guilty of unconscionable crimes, but I cannot escape the suspicion that they were part of a larger enterprise, one that may continue to operate despite their apprehension. The question that haunts me is not whether justice will be served in this case, but whether the full truth will ever come to light." As the trial of the century was set to start in Albany in January 1852, his worries would turn out to be prophetic in ways he could not have predicted. In the midst of unparalleled security and public curiosity, Elder Ezra and Deacon Silas Ravencraft's trial got underway in Albany, New York, on the 12th of January, 1852. Every day, thousands of people gathered around the courthouse, some of them from as far away as Boston and Philadelphia, to watch what the newspapers had called the trial of the unholy brothers. Inside the courtroom, the prosecution laid out a meticulous case that took place over the course of 6 weeks, with more than 100 witnesses testifying about different facets of the Ravencrafts' crimes. Medical specialists reported their tests of retrieved remains, confirming patterns of systematic torture and experimentation, and church survivors described the psychological manipulation and gradual indoctrination that had driven them to embrace progressively extreme purification rituals. The brothers profit from the sale of bodies and dust. Research was shown by financial records. The most impactful testimonies were given by victims' families, who detailed how the brothers gradually changed their loved ones before they vanished or were found dead under mysterious circumstances. Sarah Wilkinson described getting letters in her daughter Emma's handwriting that became more and more bizarre before ceasing completely. Emma had joined the church in 1847 at the age of 16 and ascended 6 months later. The final letter said she had been selected for a special blessing and that I should rejoice in her coming elevation, Wilkinson stated. When I traveled to Ravenwood to see her, Elder Ezra told me she had been transported to their retreat for spiritual preparation and would not receive visitors. 3 weeks later, he informed me she had ascended to the pure spirit during a sacred ceremony. I was not permitted to see her body, which he claimed had been sanctified, and could not leave church grounds. The defendant's actions varied greatly during the proceedings. Deacon Silas seemed reserved, rarely looking people in the eye and only whispering to his lawyers. However, Elder Ezra remained remarkably composed, frequently grinning during the most incriminating testimony and occasionally nodding as if approving of the accounts of his atrocities. The defense's approach became evident when they finally made their case in late February. They would not dispute the deaths, or even many of the practices mentioned, but rather contend that the Church of the Pure Spirit's operations were protected religious expression and that members had voluntarily taken part. William Hargrove, the defense lawyer, contended that the Constitution of these United States guarantees freedom of religious practice. This defense crumbled under cross-examination by former church members who testified to coercion, deceit, and the administration of substances now known to contain opium and other mind-altering compounds. The ceremonies of the Church of the Pure Spirit, while perhaps shocking to conventional sensibilities, were conducted with the full knowledge and consent of participants who shared the Ravencrafts' belief in purification through suffering. The prosecution's presentation of the documents from the garden, which made it abundantly evident that many of the victims had been kidnapped rather than enlisted as churchgoers, dealt the death blow. Elder Ezra made a request that would change the course of the trial on the 2nd of March, 1852. As it was coming to an unavoidable end, he sought to testify in his own defense. After much consideration, the judge granted it, against the firm counsel of his lawyers. Perhaps the most terrifying trial testimony in American judicial history was what transpired next. Elder Ezra gave what amounted to a lecture on his beliefs and practices for almost 4 hours without using any notes. Instead of denying the accusations or expressing regret, he presented a cogent, if horrifying, philosophy that fused scientific logic with religious mysticism for the sake of the elevation of humanity through systematic understanding of transcendence. His words, "Death comes to all," shook the courtroom. Most troubling was his obvious intellectual capacity and the methodical way he had developed a belief system to justify atrocity. We merely gave it purpose. Those who ascended through our ministrations contributed to knowledge that will ultimately benefit all mankind. Their suffering was temporary. Their contribution was eternal. He described death as merely a transition of energy, agony as the purest form of consciousness, and his victims as willing participants in the greatest scientific and spiritual endeavor of our age. Prosecutor James Sullivan inquired about the youngsters discovered at the garden, and Elder Ezra's answer caused the courtroom to erupt in applause. "The young vessel receives the Spirit most purely," he responded. "Their observations were most valuable precisely because they were unclouded by preconception. We honored them by allowing their suffering to illuminate paths others fear to tread." A man in the gallery, who was later identified as Harold Winters, hurried toward the witness stand, brandishing a concealed knife at this statement. Winters' son had vanished after attending a church service in 1847. Before he could approach Elder Ezra, he was stopped by court officers, yet he did not recoil or try to move. "You see," said Elder Ezra calmly when Winters was taken out, "even now, the mere suggestion of truth provokes violence from those too limited to comprehend it. This has always been the response to those who push beyond conventional boundaries of knowledge and belief." Deacon Silas chose not to testify following Elder Ezra's testimony. In a succinct statement, his lawyer said that his client had been influenced by his brother and asked for forgiveness. The brothers' crimes were calculated, their victims suffered, and their conduct betrayed both religious beliefs and scientific principles, according to the prosecution's closing statements. After less than 3 hours of deliberation, the jury returned with guilty verdicts for both defendants on all counts. The Ravencraft brothers were sentenced to hang on the 10th of March, 1852, by Judge William Blackwood, who deemed their crimes an offense against God, humanity, and the moral foundation upon which civilized society rests. The execution date was set for April 15th, but things would take a surprising turn in the weeks that followed. On March 20, Prophet Caleb, who had been housed in the asylum at Utica, passed away inexplicably. According to official accounts, he had died of nervous exhaustion, but there were speculations that attendants who had heard of his involvement in the infamous case had either killed him or committed suicide. More importantly, the Albany jail where the Ravencraft brothers were being housed caught fire on the evening of April 7. 3 prisoners and 2 guards had perished from smoke inhalation by the time the fire was contained. According to early reports, Deacon Silas was one of the deceased, and his body could be recognized by the peculiar rings he wore. However, neither the dead nor the survivors included Elder Ezra. The ensuing manhunt was the biggest in the history of New York State. Wanted posters were circulated throughout the Northeast as federal officials joined local law enforcement in their search for the escaped prisoner. Sightings from as far away as Chicago and Montreal were reported, but none resulted in arrest. Concerning questions concerning the circumstances surrounding the jail fire and the death of Deacon Silas surfaced as weeks went by without any resolution. Rather than clearly identifying the severely charred body, the official identification had been done in a hurry, mainly based on personal belongings. Blackwood was among the investigators who questioned whether either brother had truly perished in the fire. The timing and nature of the incident suggests planning and outside assistance. Blackwood wrote in a report that was kept classified. The possibility must be considered that both brothers escaped, with one corpse misidentified as Deacon Silas, while another prisoner remains unaccounted for in the confusion. This theory gained support when investigators found that, just 2 days prior to the fire, a significant amount, nearly $30,000, had been taken out of a church-affiliated bank account by a person who fit the description of Jacob Thornton, one of the brothers' most loyal followers, who vanished after their arrest. The most unsettling event occurred in June 1852 when a Baltimore doctor was discovered dead in his house under strange circumstances. Among the medical personnel accused of accepting specimens from the Church of the Pure Spirit was Dr. Edward Mitchell. Despite his cooperation and lack of prosecution, his body was found in the exact same position as the elevated victims from the church, with a note pinned to his chest that read simply, The Spirit sees all who betray its work. This murder, along with the murders of 2 other doctors who had been involved in the case over the course of the following year, raised suspicions that the brothers or their supporters were deliberately eradicating those who had helped with the investigation. Those who had been involved in the investigation were terrified when they discovered all of the victims in the same ceremonial pose and with the same letter. The active investigation had been reduced by 1854, and it was assumed that Elder Ezra had left the nation. Reports of religious organizations that resembled the Church of the Pure Spirit occasionally surfaced from far-flung locations, including San Francisco, St. Louis, and New Orleans, but none of them resulted in the notorious preacher's imprisonment. Blackwood, who had been moved to other cases but kept up his private investigation into the Ravencrafts, came to believe that Elder Ezra had not just gotten away, but had reorganized his operation in a different place, possibly with the help of a larger network of followers than first thought. The Ravencraft case represents not the end of a criminal enterprise, but merely its exposure, he stated in his last report before retiring in 1860. The combination of religious fervor, scientific curiosity without moral constraint, and the promise of transcendent knowledge creates a powerful allure that did not die with our prosecution of 2 of its practitioners. I fear we have merely driven this darkness further into the shadows, where it continues its work beyond our sight. His prediction would turn out to be accurate. During the ensuing decades, there were sporadic accounts of religious organizations that bore a remarkable resemblance to the Church of the Pure Spirit. These groups would surface for a short time before vanishing again, frequently leaving behind mysterious disappearances. The pattern indicated Elder Ezra Ravencraft's influence persisted even though none were directly connected to him. A modest chapel identifying itself as the Sanctuary of Divine Understanding was found abandoned close to the Massachusetts-Vermont border in 1862, 10 years after the initial instance. This was the most notable of these incidents. An abandoned building with a secret cellar that had evidence of recent ritual activity in line with Ravencraft practices was discovered by local authorities looking into reports of unusual lights and noises. The most unsettling was a journal that was found at the location and was written in a script that specialists would later verify matched Elder Ezra's known handwriting. The last note, written just 3 days prior to the find, stated, "The work continues as it must. Each vessel contributes to understanding. Each elevation brings the final revelation closer. 100 years from now, when the full truth emerges, all will recognize our sacrifice as the foundation of a new age of understanding. The Spirit is patient, so too must be its servants." It has never been proved with certainty whether this was an elaborate fraud or Elder Ezra's true deathbed testament. If it were true, it would mean that he had lived to be 115 years old, which is a very unlikely but not impossible longevity. The journal's comprehensive experimental procedures and observations, which seem to have impacted some respectable medical research in the early 20th century, were more important than the authorship dispute, indicating that aspects of the brothers' work had, in spite of their horrifying techniques, permeated mainstream science. Officials at Harvard quickly restricted public access to the materials after realizing their nature. Following discussions with federal officials, the material was moved to a secure government archive in 1902 and remained classified there until 1972, when researchers studying the history of medical ethics were given restricted access. Before the state of New York declared the location of the original Church of the Pure Spirit in Ravenwood a restricted area in 1923, fencing the property and erecting signs warning of trespassing, the site was unoccupied. People who went too close to the perimeter reported odd lights, unexplainable noises, and a sense of overwhelming dread, according to local legends that the earth was cursed. The first archaeological survey of the site was carried out in 1967 by a team from the State University of New York who used then-current methods to investigate regions that had not been accessible at the time of the initial examination. Their findings, which included more human remains in parts of the tunnel system that had not been previously explored, raised the estimated number of victims to nearly 400, much more than the 276 listed in the official record. The finding of a sealed chamber, with exceptionally well-preserved records that seemed to explain plans for expansion beyond Ravenwood, was the most unsettling. According to these materials, the Church of the Pure Spirit was just supposed to be the first stop in a chain of such enterprises across the U.S. and possibly overseas. Elder Ezra might have carried on pursuing this idea after he fled. More than 160 years after the Ravencrafts' reign of terror came to light, their influence may still be seen today in a variety of fields. They serve as a stark illustration in religious studies of how atrocities can be made possible by charismatic leadership, the gradual normalizing of abnormal behavior, and the human need for transcendent significance. Their case is still highlighted in medical ethics as a fundamental illustration of the need for moral boundaries in scientific research. They are regarded as early examples of methodical, organized murderers who were shielded by reputable social organizations in the field of criminal psychology. But for the families and communities affected by their crimes, the Ravencrafts stand for something more immediate and intimate, a scar in American history that has never completely healed. Survivors and victims' descendants continue to assemble every year for a brief ceremony at a memorial built in Albany in 1902, with the straightforward words, "For those lost to darkness, that their suffering not be forgotten." How did the brothers come up with their distinctive combination of pseudo-scientific experimentation and religious control? These are still the questions that plagued investigator Blackwood in 1852. Who else was aware of them or helped them in their activities? Most troubling of all, how much of their power is still unacknowledged in the organizations and concepts that continue to impact American culture. The real horror of the Ravencraft case is not just the brothers' hideous deeds, but also the realization that their tale is not an anomaly, but rather a sinister possibility, rooted in human nature's ability for both awe and cruelty. Their history serves as a cautionary tale about the perils that arise when our deepest moral principles are subordinated to the power of charisma, authority, and dogma. The site of the former Church of the Pure Spirit in the thick forests of upstate New York is still deserted. The ground, still marked by foundations that time seems incapable of erasing. As if something in that earth still absorbs sound, light, and warmth, hungry for the human agony that once fed it so abundantly, locals claim that even now, on especially silent nights, the area is defined by an eerie silence. This riddle demonstrates how fragile civilization's facade can be when powerful people use science and religion to further their own sinister agendas. How do you feel about this tale? Do you think it was all revealed? Post a comment below. Please hit the notification bell, subscribe, and tell a mystery-loving friend if you liked this story and would like to see more horror tales like it. See you at the following one.